dark haze. Ladies of the night with eyes of red, vampires in the alleys where good men dread, wolfmen howling beneath the pale moon. But justice is coming and coming soon. From saloons to graveyards where evil sleeps, they walk among us, secrets they keep, nightmare hunters with souls ablaze, cleaning up this town through the dark haze. Cryptids themselves, yet they stand tall against the darkness, answering the call for every lost soul, every whispered prayer. They fight for the light in the midnight air. From saloons to graveyards where evil sleeps, they walk among us, secrets they keep, nightmare hunters with souls ablaze, cleaning up this town through the dark haze. The night is young, the hunt begins. For against the darkness where hope never ends.
Good evening, folks. Welcome to another episode of the Nightmare Hunters podcast. I'm your host, D.A. Roberts, and as always, I'm joined from my brother from another mother, Robbie Jed Rains. But before we jump into the deep woods and dark hollows tonight, let's take a minute for our community. If y'all got a prayer request for yourself, your family, for a friend, or just for someone that's going through a hard time, let us know, because we lift each other up around here, and we're already got a few folks on the list for this week, and let's keep every one of them in our thoughts and prayers. Miss Lene, who's still continuing to heal. Robbie, who, as most of y'all know, has been going through a lot of family stuff. Doc, whose business is needing the prayers. Miss Maggie, who's been a guest on the show. I won't say the reason, she's just having some medical issues, and we'll leave it at that. And of course, my sister Becky. So if you keep all those folks in your prayers, and anybody else that pops up in the chat, we'd be praying for y'all too. So Robbie, how you doing tonight, brother? How you been?
I'm ready for June 26th to get the hell out of my rearview mirror. This has probably been the worst month of my life.
I'm sorry, brother.
Yeah, I mean, like I was telling you, we were kind of expecting it with my grandmother. Still didn't make it any easier.
Never
But
does.
then, week and a half, 2 weeks later, my uncle gets hit by some idiot while he's trying to work on his lawnmower, gets knocked over 20 yards, and suddenly it's all his fault. And it's just, we're fighting with that, and people on Facebook being idiots about it. And it's, this has just not been a good month.
Oh, I'm sorry, brother. Well, maybe tonight we can think about something else for a little while, get your mind off things, and hopefully things will get better. So again, folks, keep Robbie in your prayers. His family's had a lot of tragedy lately, and still going through a lot of mess with it. And we'll all be praying for Robbie on that. So ready to jump in tonight, brother?
Ready as I'll ever be.
All right. Well, tonight we're doing an episode on Denali, the silent corridor, the missing in Zone Juliet, because some trails don't just end, they simply disappear. So welcome back to the Nightmare Hunters. We're glad you're spending part of your evening with us, whether you're joining us live here on YouTube or listening later on one of the other podcast platforms, or even if you're catching the replay at some point down the road. But before we get started tonight, if you guys enjoy what we're doing here, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and share the stream with somebody you know who enjoys cryptids, mysteries, folklore, missing persons cases, and all kinds of unexplained stuff. And if you'd like to support the channel even further, be sure to check out the channel memberships and the Patreon. Every bit helps support us and continue to do the research and bringing these investigations to you guys each week. But tonight, we're heading into the north, into Alaska, into one of the most recognizable wilderness areas in North America. We're going to be talking about Denali National Park. Now, most people hear the name Denali and immediately think of the mountain, and that's understandable. I mean, it is the tallest peak in North America. It's become almost synonymous with adventure, exploration, and extreme wilderness. But what often gets overlooked is everything surrounding it, surrounding the mountain itself. The park itself covers more than 6 million acres. That's bigger than the Mark Twain National Forest and the Ozarks National Forest combined. 6 million acres, and most of that is landscape that remains as wild and as unforgiving today as it was 100 years ago. But over the years, Denali has developed a reputation for lots of different reasons. Some people know it because of climbing accidents and survival stories. Some know it because of the missing person cases. There's a missing 411 cluster right there in Denali. Others know it because of encounter reports involving large upright figures, unusual sounds, strange tracks, and observations that don't fit comfortably into any conventional explanation. Now, normally, those subjects are discussed separately. One group focuses on the disappearances, another focuses on the encounter reports. But what caught my attention several years ago was the fact that the same locations seem to appear regardless of which category I happen to be researching. I'd start with a missing person case and eventually find myself looking at encounter reports from that region. Then I'd be researching those reports and end up reading a historical account that brought me right back to that same spot. The question that kept coming to mind wasn't whether these reports were connected. That's a conclusion, and conclusions shouldn't come at the end. It should come at the end of the investigation, not at the beginning. The question that came to me was much simpler than that. Why did the same places keep appearing over and over again? Now, that question eventually became part of what we now call the zone theory. And tonight, we're going to take a closer look at one of those regions that helped shape the zone theory. We're going to be talking about disappearances. We're going to talk about encounter reports. We're going to talk about reoccurring behaviors that seem to show up in witness statements from Alaska year after year. We'll discuss sounds that the witnesses struggle to identify, reports involving observation behavior, and a few ideas that we've explored on previous episodes, including adaptive camouflage, the tongue pop theory, and others. As always, we're not here to tell you what to believe. We're not here to force a conclusion. We're here to examine the evidence, ask questions, and see where the investigation takes us. So settle in, get comfortable, and join us as we head into Denali National Park and one of the most interesting regions we've encountered in our research. This is episode 419, folks. So, Robbie, what comes to mind when you think of Denali?
Well, before you started reading all that, I guess the biggest thing was, the gold rush. Denali and Yukon was some of the richest places for the gold rush of Alaska, and probably still are, I would think.
One of the first things that pops into my mind is a story we've told several times on this show about the old boy that shot the park ranger that with a 7mm Magnum that killed a 14-foot grizzly bear that had a hiker in its belly. That story pops right back to mind because that was in Denali.
That's the one that had the 38 revolver.
Yeah, had the hiker and the 38 revolver in its belly.
Yeah, maybe not use a 38 when you're hiking in Denali then.
Yeah, I don't think a 38 did. Well, they found all the slugs from the 38 in the bear lodged in its sternum. So it didn't even punch. He didn't do much more than just aggravate it.
Apparently.
Yeah. But, Alaska, if you look at Alaska, the area known as the Alaskan Triangle has been responsible for, 66,000 missing persons since the late 60s?
I think that number sounds right.
A a lot of people gone missing in that little area. But Denali is a big part of that too. So, as we start into this investigation, we don't really want to jump to any conclusions. We want to examine the patterns. We want to examine what we talk about tonight, and then toward the end of the show, we'll start putting that all together. And I hope you guys will come along with us. And we'd love to hear you guys' suggestions as we go. But Robbie, you want to take us into segment 1 and talk about why we chose Alaska?
Okay, so as DA said, why Alaska? One of the questions that we've been asked quite a bit over the last few years is how the zone theory came about in the first place. Most people assume we started with a map and worked backwards, but that's not really what happened. The truth is we weren't trying to develop a theory. We were just trying to do what we've always done, which is researching reports, following leads, reading historical accounts, looking into cases, that caught our attention. So eventually some things started standing out, and what stood out in particular, what eventually stood out wasn't a particular sighting or a disappearance or encounter. It was the fact that certain places kept showing up no matter what happened or what the research was. So first, we didn't think too much of it. It's just one of those things like, oh, well, there's that again. Oh, well, yeah, there it is again. So, but if you spend enough time studying subjects or studying these subjects, you're naturally going to run into some of the same locations over and over again, and that's just part of the process. Places with a long history tend to generate stories like that. Excuse me. Where was I at? Places with a long history seem to generate stories like that, and some regions simply receive more attention than others. The longer that we looked at it, though, the more we realized that that wasn't what we were really seeing. The thing that caught our attention wasn't the number of reports; it was the variety. So, not necessarily a huge number, but a huge or maybe not a huge, but just a bigger variety than what we talked about in some of these other locations. So we might spend a few days looking into missing persons cases and end up in a particular region, then move on to something completely different and find ourselves back at the mod thing came up over top of my where I was sat and I lost my place. We'd spend a few days looking at missing persons cases and end up in a particular region, then move on to something completely different, and we'd find ourselves back in the same area again. But like we said, just with a different sighting or different variety or type of sighting. Sometimes it was an encounter report. Sometimes it was a historical account. Sometimes it was a witness describing tracks or sounds or observations that didn't fit comfortably in any category at all. The reports themselves weren't necessarily similar. In many cases, they had nothing to do with one another. What they shared was the geography. After a while, we stopped paying as much attention to the individual stories and started paying more attention to where those stories were happening. Once we started doing that, Alaska became kind of difficult to ignore. And I think as many times as we've talked about Alaska on this show, you kind of see that tend to push itself towards the forefront. So before anybody misunderstands what we're talking about, Alaska has a lot working against it when it comes to this kind of research. It's enormous. You've heard us talk about it. DA said it. If you could explore 1 square mile a day, it would take you how many years, DA, to explore Alaska?
125 years. And that's if you never
long
stopped.
time. That's ginormous. So it contains some of the most remote wilderness left in North America. And that you've heard us talk about how much national park land there is in America, 88 million acres. Well, Alaska is the biggest part of that. And it's big, it's massive. People outside this country can't fathom how big this the states in this country are, and we can't fathom how big Alaska is, and it's part of our country. That's just how big Alaska is. People disappear there every year. Search efforts fail. Witness reports usually witnesses report unusual things. Hunters, guides, bush pilots, and outdoorsmen occasionally have experiences they struggle to explain. And none of these things should surprise us. What interested us, though, was how often Alaska seemed to appear regardless of the category or the category of the reports that we were looking at. So more that so are we having those difficulties again?
Maybe.
You still there, DA? You froze up for a second.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, I hear you. You froze up for a split second. I just want to make sure I wasn't talking to myself. Yeah, row. So the more we looked into it, the more we found ourselves asking whether we were simply noticing a coincidence or whether there was actually a pattern hiding in the data. That's important. That's an important disconnect because those aren't the same things. Coincidences happen and patterns happen too. The challenge is figuring out which one you're looking at. So that's really where the zone theory came from. We started piecing all this stuff together and started looking at these different areas and the different types. And, I say DA did a lot of this stuff, but, he did most of the...
Based on all of our research.
Yeah, but he did most of the heavy lifting and putting the theory together. But it was, it was based on theories that we all had, that we all shared. So... And really, it wasn't an attempt to explain anything. It was an effort to prove the existence of creatures or solve every mystery in the wilderness in North America. It was simply an observation that certain regions appear often enough that they deserve closer examination. So, it was kind of born of, a lot of this stuff looks like it could go here, and a lot of this stuff could go here. And, it was never... It's kind of like what DA said at first. It was kind of the conclusion presenting itself before we had all the questions. That's really how it panned out, which is kind of how a lot of our theories have ended up. We've already had the answers before the questions got asked, and then the questions got asked. We're like, wait, we know that. So one of those regions became the one we now call Zone Juliet. So DA continued digging into Alaska more than any of the rest of us because this, I think Alaska is the zone that really infatuates DA more than, not that it doesn't, to me, Doc, Steve, or anybody else in the group, but I think Alaska's got a place in DA's heart. Am I wrong? Am I wrong on it?
Oh, you're absolutely correct.
I figured. So
there's just so much there to choose from. I mean,
right.
Denali.
Yeah.
I mean, there's as a researcher, a place I could spend years.
It holds the same fascination for you that Antarctica does for me.
Right.
You're still...
I'd love to go there too.
Yeah, but you know how much I've read and delved into Antarctica, so that's a flip flop for you. You know a lot about Antarctica, but you've really took a deep dive into Alaska. So, but as you were doing your deep dives and you kept digging, one location in particular kept coming up and finding its way back into the conversation. It didn't matter whether you were looking at encounter reports, disappearances, historical accounts, or more recent investigations, but Denali seemed to be sitting right in the middle of the discussion. No matter what you did, it always came up. No matter which direction you turned to start digging, you always found Denali. Right? Pretty much?
Yeah. So the trails led back to Denali every time.
Yep. So at a certain point, you kind of came to the conclusion that you had two choices. You could continue traveling or continue treating it as a coincidence, or you could start asking some questions about why it kept happening. And these are some of the conversations that me, you, Doc, and Steve have had. So that's really what tonight's episode's about. We're not trying to prove a theory. We're not trying to force a conclusion. We're simply following a question that has been sitting in the back of DA's mind and all of our minds for a long time. Why does Denali keep showing up? You know, no, like I said, no matter which way DA turned and which trail or which breadcrumb he picked up, seemed like it always, led back there. So that's kind of the purpose of tonight is why. So why do you think, DA?
Well, for one thing, there's just the sheer number of people that have gone missing in Denali. And I'm not saying that we're going to lay every disappearance at the foot of Bigfoot or Dogman or whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to believe is out there, because there are aggressive bears in Denali. There are lost little valleys and old mines that are dot the mountainside where people could vanish. So there's a lot of reasons a person could just disappear without a trace in Denali. But much like the missing 411 cases, we're really only going to kind of highlight the ones that defy explanation. Because yes, people do go missing. Yes, a lot of those do get solved, but we're going to be looking at the ones that didn't, and it's shocking how many there are of those. Because you've really got to look at all the points on all your data points on a map to kind of distinguish between which is just coincidence and what's a legitimate pattern. And Denali hits that pattern.
Yeah, it's one of those things, like you said, it's distinct enough in its terrain to where you can say, oh, it's a remote area. People go, like I mentioned with the gold rush, people go out there that they don't know what they're doing, and it's a remote area, and they get in over their heads. Something happens to them. They whatever. It's got that enough distinction like that where sometimes people don't look quite deep enough like they should, and just write it off as, oh, it was they wandered off looking for gold and got lost, got hurt, got whatever,
Got
or
grizzly.
got it by a bear, whatever the case may be. It's one of those locations where it's remote enough where people can just write it off easier than if somebody walked out into the woods just down the road from your house or mine. It'd be a little bit different. So I think that kind of lends to that. Okay, so what was the number we said? 66,000 or so.
Thereabouts, yeah.
Thereabouts. That from, and not all those from Denali, obviously. That's Alaska in general, but I would assume that a big portion of those probably came from Denali.
Well, that's the Alaskan Triangle, but Denali takes up a good chunk of the Alaskan Triangle.
So you cannot say that every single one of those 66,000, either fell off a cliff, got hit by a bear, or just died from, because that's a lot of people. That is a lot of people to just write off and say, nature. I mean, obviously, if it is Bigfoot and Bigfoot is what we think it is just an animal, then yes, that technically does cover it, nature. But of what major science would claim as just nature.
Well, there are things out there that have nothing to do with Bigfoot that can and will kill you, including the environment. A lot of people go out for like a day hike or a weekend camp out, and they forget that, much like Robbie's T-shirt, Mother Nature is a honey badger, and she don't care. Weather turns bad in Alaska without much warning. People get out there, are unprepared, and the elements will kill them just as dead as any grizzly will. But again, those are not the stories that we're going to be profiling. We're going to be talking about the ones where they just, even tracking dogs wouldn't track, because generally they at least have some sort of closure. They find piece of a body, they find camping equipment, at least something to give them an idea of what happened to them. But the ones we're going to be talking about, the ones that matter the most to us, are the ones that defy logic, the ones that defy explanation, the ones even the park rangers are like, yeah, I can tell you what's going on. But I'll tell you something interesting about the park rangers up there. Every park ranger I've met here in Missouri carries a Glock, just like I did when I was a cop. The guys up in Denali, they carry 44 Magnums. Now, I'm sure part of that's for the bears, but that's a lot of firepower for to be toting around on your hip.
Yeah.
They ain't playing around up there.
But there again, they have that plausible deniability to be able to say, "Oh, it's just for the bears," and who's really going to question it? Because okay, that makes sense. Because most normal people are going to look at that and think, "Well, that makes perfect sense." But people who know, like you said, know that that's still a whole lot of firepower, even for a bear.
Right. And we're not going to just look at every missing person and immediately go Bigfoot, because everybody that's watched this show knows that's not what we do. Again, we're going to be profiling cases that have a lot of very bizarre circumstances surrounding them, people who have vanished without a trace, that sort of thing. And again, at the end of the day, we're not going to just say Bigfoot did this. We're going to discuss the similarities. We're going to discuss the patterns of behavior, because that's what we do. Robbie and I, and Doc when he's here, and Steve when he can join us, we approach this from an evidence-based, much like we would a police investigation. We build basically a crime scene board, and we start ruling things out. Same thing we did with the Joe Bald video we shot. We started asking. We went back there, measured the scene. We started saying, what could it have been? What could have not been? And that's the way we approach all of these. So tonight, as we dig more into this, you're going to see a lot more of this type of discussion. As we say, okay, this is what happened. These are the patterns. These are the observed patterns. These are the ones they suspect. And we're going to build a case from that. And at the end of the night, if you guys stick with us, maybe we'll come to similar conclusions. So you want to jump into the next segment?
Let's do it.
All right. Segment 2 says, what makes a disappearance unusual? And this is an interesting part where we're going to start really kind of laying this out for you. But before we start looking at specific cases, I think we need to establish something that's often missing from these conversations. Not every disappearance is a mystery. That should sound obvious, but you'd be surprised how often people skip over that distinction. If somebody goes missing in the wilderness, that doesn't automatically mean something unusual happened. Sometimes people just get lost. Sometimes they get hurt. Sometimes weather changes rapidly. Sometimes they make a decision that seemed perfectly reasonable at the time and turns out to be the wrong one in a spectacular way. Wilderness areas can be unforgiving, and Alaska has a very good way of reminding people of that. One of the reasons I want to spend some time talking about this before we get into the cases is because I think a lot of people approach disappearances backward. They start with the assumption that something strange happened and then look for evidence to support that conclusion. As investigators, we have to do the opposite. We start with the evidence and let the evidence determine where the conversation goes. Over the years, we've all seen cases that were presented as unexplained mysteries, only to discover later that they were perfectly reasonable explanations that simply weren't being discussed. That's one of the dangers of getting your information from headlines, from social media posts, or YouTube clips. The details that make the case less mysterious are often the same details that get left out. So, what exactly are we looking for? Well, for me, it usually starts with a simple question. If I remove all the speculation, all the theories, and all the assumptions, is there still something about the case that doesn't make sense? And that's where things start getting interesting, because sometimes that answer is no. Sometimes a case appears mysterious until you start digging into the facts. Once you understand the terrain, the weather, the timeline, the circumstances involved, then the mystery begins to disappear. Other cases are different, though. You can account for the terrain, you can account for the weather, you can even account for the known facts, but you're still left with questions. And those are the cases that tend to hold my attention. That doesn't mean they're paranormal, it doesn't mean they're supernatural, and it doesn't mean they involve cryptids. It simply means there are aspects of the case that remain unresolved. One of the things I've noticed over the years is that people often confuse a lack of information with evidence of something unusual. Those are not the same thing. In a place like Alaska, there are situations where investigators may never have enough information to determine exactly what happened. The wilderness doesn't always leave us a complete story. In fact, one of the questions we're going to come back to several times tonight is whether some of these cases tell us more about the environment than they do about the missing person. And that's something worth thinking about. We live in a world where people assume everything can be tracked, recorded, documented, and explained. We have GPS units, satellite imagery, drones, search aircraft, and communication systems that previous generations couldn't even have imagined. Despite all of that, there's still places where a person can just vanish and leave behind very few answers. That's not necessarily evidence of something extraordinary. It may simply be the evidence that the wilderness is still larger and more complex than we'd like to admit. So as we move into our first case, I want you to keep one thing in mind. The goal isn't to solve the disappearance. The goal is to understand why it continues generating questions. Those are two very different points. So, Robbie, what separates a tragedy from a mystery?
Oh, tragedy from a mystery. I would say a tragedy can be almost anything, like, from a plane crash that there's no engine went out, plane crashed, everybody died. That's a tragedy. It's not a mystery because the engine went out, and it's totally known what happened. A mystery could be more along the lines of an entire Roman legion walks off into the, and is never heard from again.
Exactly.
Is that still a tragedy? Yes, but the bigger mystery is what happened, because you can't explain it.
Right. Well, to use your airplane analogy, we're talking about a plane, when a plane goes down because, like, for engine trouble or gets struck by lightning or something, and we're able to track it and find it. Again, you're right, that's a tragedy. But in the 1940s, somewhere near Denali, a DC-10 carrying a congressman and multiple military personnel went down without a trace and has never been found. And a DC-10 is not a small aircraft.
And while tragic, that's a mystery, because
we don't know what's in it down or where it went.
Yeah, so I would say that the difference would be a tragedy. You have pretty much all. I don't want to say all the answers, because you still may be asking yourself why this happened, but there's no question, I guess, or
tragedies are solved, mysteries are unsolved.
Unsolved, yeah.
Yeah. So how often do you think people mistake a lack of information as evidence?
I'd say probably happens more than,
especially in this field.
Yeah. And sometimes a lack of evidence can tell you stuff. Sometimes a lack of evidence can tell you a lot of stuff. It can tell you how much effort was put into something. And, a lot of people don't think about that. I mean, if the man hours on the case are very low and there's not a lot of evidence, okay, well, that tells you why there's not a lot of evidence, because there's not a lot of man hours put into it. Okay, they didn't go and really. It was one of those things where they're like, nah, there's no reason for this. More than likely, there's no reason to do this. We've talked about that before, where certain people go missing and they'll send everybody, and they'll spend months searching for this person, and then next time somebody disappears, they'll search for a day or two, and they're like, oh well, we'll never find them.
Right. And it's weird
And
that they do that.
and that will be a mystery because you don't know why. But
So, Robbie, I'll be the first one to admit you've got more experience in law enforcement than I do by at least a decade. So, I'm going to defer to your knowledge on this. So, I want to kind of put a situation to you that will explain the difference in how terrain will affect your investigation. Let's say you worked as a school resource officer. Let's say you get a call right there at the school for a kid that's missing. Now, let's think about that, how you would approach that, and compare that to how you would handle the investigation if you got a call to go out to the backside of the horse pasture and because you got a kid missing.
oh, that's that's two totally different animals. Because
Terrain changes it.
yeah, because right there in the and yes, my school's on the outskirts of the city, but there's still and there might be woods right there at the school, but there's still a perimeter. There's still, within 5-10 minutes, I can have officers and patrol cars surrounding every, if we know they went out the back door and they're missing and they're in those woods, I can have that whole set of woods surrounded in 5 to 10 minutes. Whereas in the horse pasture, that's completely, totally different animal altogether. I can't remember what the acreage is. I want to say that was like, Rodney helped me out. I want to say it's like 5,000-6,000 acres. The Jim Timberman, I think it's Wildlife Preserve is what it's actually officially called. But you don't just, that's not just a casual. Give me 5-6 guys up here to, to walk the area. That's a couple hundred people to search an area like
Tracking
that.
dogs, man, using your tracking skills becomes
Yeah.
a whole different animal.
Oh yeah, and you immediately go into a different mode if it's something like that versus something that they're missing from the school. Okay, from the school, there's houses where you can send out. The school can send out text message alerts. The police department can send out mass text message alerts, with descriptions, things like that. And, anybody that has got that, I can't remember the name of the little app thing that we've got. Anybody that's got that would automatically get that. And if they see the child, there, call it in and there we are.
Right.
That might not help that much because somebody would have to be out there and get that, and then actually see that that child out there. Which a child in an environment like that may not be that easy to find.
Yeah. Same thing would apply for a park ranger. Let's say, for example, Denali, since that's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
If a person went missing in a campground in the main part of the park where it's clearly marked, where people have campsites with electricity and that, if somebody disappears there, the investigation is going to look totally different than if a guy who got a permit for the backcountry fails to check in.
Yeah.
So, how do you think social media affects public perception of these missing person cases? I think social media is very quick to jump to conclusions without evidence.
Well, considering what I've seen over the past couple of weeks, I'd say people jump to conclusions really quickly based off what they see on social media. And some of them will freaking die on a hill arguing with somebody who was standing there at the time it happened or right after it happened. So yeah, I'd say social media is it's a double-edged sword because I know it helps us out a lot, but it also I was way off. Rodney said it's 33,000 acres.
That's a big area.
Yeah. and that's small as far as the places we've talked about goes.
Right.
But yeah, I would say it's it can be damning too, especially when people want to get on there and start, putting a bunch of stuff on there that they always want to. There's always somebody that knows. Well, I thought I saw her over here. Or I thought I saw him over there. Look, if you didn't see him, don't clog it up. But that
Don't
you
speculate,
inevitably
yeah.
you've got that, and it,
So, from a law enforcement standpoint, what standards should, and like a researcher, like a Bigfoot researcher, what standards should researchers apply to one of these missing persons cases before they call it unusual? Because a lot of them immediately just go, Bigfoot took this guy.
I mean, I think there has to be a standard, obviously, or you wouldn't ask the question. Um, and I hate to compare it or use the missing 411, but Pilates he's got a pretty decent formula of, I don't know, he's been accused of cherry picking things in the past, but he's got a formula and his formula works. I mean, if it doesn't meet XYZ, then it doesn't make it into that.
Exactly.
Same thing with BFRO. If a report doesn't meet XYZ, it doesn't make it in. So I think there has to be, maybe not so stringent, but stringent enough to where it doesn't, you don't want to let the filter down too much to where just any and everything can come in, but you got to have enough of a filter there to where you don't want to bog yourself down on where all you're doing is throwing away the ones that don't match, because that's all you'd be doing. You wouldn't be doing any research. You'd just be culling the ones that don't match the criteria. So you just got to walk that line about what's good enough to keep with the majority of the ones that don't belong out, but still, loose enough to where you get, because not everybody's gonna. You and I, as close as we are and the way we think and all that stuff, if we have an encounter, we're going to see it two separate ways. So, but does that mean you're wrong and I'm right, or I'm right or I'm wrong and you're right? No, it doesn't. It just means we're two individual people. So if we are off in two separate pieces or areas of the woods, and we have one run by us and we see it, and I happen to see it carrying a little kid, and you see it from the other side and you don't see it carrying anything, and you want to have enough to where, you follow what I'm saying, you don't want to leave people out just because your qualifications are so stringent that some good cases may be left out of the mix just because they didn't meet what your criteria says. But you also don't, like I said, don't want to have.
So I think it'd be safe to say that when you're evaluating these cases for missing person reports, you not only need to look at the similarities, but that you need to look at the differences, because sometimes the differences make all the difference.
Yeah, because like I said, depending on where I had a sighting versus where you had a sighting, I may have seen a whole different side, whatever. I may have,
like you and Johnny.
Yeah, me and Johnny
saw it from different angles, and it appeared to be a different color.
Yeah. So I mean, but because I saw a brownish color and Johnny saw a black color, does that mean because I saw a brownish color that means I automatically saw a bear and Johnny didn't, or vice versa?
Right.
No.
Right.
So
I mean, I want to take us into segment three now. We got about 10 minutes about 10 minutes till we got to take a break. So I think that gives us just enough time to go over this next segment.
All right, segment 3, case file number 1, Nathan Campbell. One of the reasons we wanted to spend some time talking about how we evaluate disappearances before getting into specific cases is because it's very easy to let mystery become bigger than the facts.
Once that happens, people stop investigating what occurred and start investigating what they think occurred. Those are two very different things. And the case of Nathan Campbell is a good example of that. If you spend any time looking into disappearances in Alaska over the last few years, you've probably come across his name. The basic outline of the case is fairly straightforward. In 2020, Campbell arranged to be flown into a remote area near Carey Lake in Alaska for an extended solo stay. He was an outdoorsman. He intentionally sought out remote places, and this wasn't somebody who wandered into the wilderness by accident. He went out there because he wanted to be alone. At first glance, there isn't anything particularly unusual about that. Alaska is full of people who hunt, fish, trap, hike, and like to spend extended periods of time in the backcountry. Every year, people travel into these remote regions looking for solitude, adventure, or simply an opportunity to get away from the rest of the world for a little while. The problem begins when something goes wrong. At some point, concern began to grow because Campbell failed to return as expected. Search efforts were launched. Investigators began trying to reconstruct a timeline, and the process of determining what happened got underway. What interests us about this case isn't that he disappeared, and as unfortunate as that may be, the disappearances happen in Alaska every year. But what does interest us is how quickly the conversation surrounding the case moved beyond the available evidence. The farther people got from the facts, the more theories began to emerge. That's not unique to this case, and it happens all the time. People are uncomfortable with uncertainty. When information is limited, the human mind naturally starts trying to fill in the blanks. We want a complete story. We want an explanation. We want a reason that makes sense of what happened. The problem is that nature doesn't always cooperate with that desire. One of the questions that we kept coming back to after reading it was whether we were learning anything new about Campbell. Was we learning anything new about his disappearance, or whether we were simply watching people respond to the absence of information. That's an important distinction. There are cases where the evidence points towards a conclusion. There are cases where evidence points away from a conclusion. Then there are cases where evidence simply runs out. So for us, Alaska forces us to confront that reality more than most places. The average person tends to think of a search as a process that eventually produces an answer. Sometimes it does, but sometimes a missing person is located. Sometimes investigators are able to go and determine what happened and provide closure for the family. Unfortunately, there are also those situations where the search ends before the questions do. The wilderness doesn't owe us any explanation, and that's one of the hardest truths investigators have to accept. A place like Denali or the surrounding Alaskan backcountry can be beautiful, but can also be enormous beyond people's ability to comprehend. Distances are deceptive, terrain is unforgiving, weather can change rapidly, visibility can be limited, small mistakes can become major problems in a surprisingly short amount of time. None of those things explain what happened to Nathan Campbell, though. What they do explain is why some disappearances remain unsolved. One of the things that we've noticed over the years is that people often treat an unresolved case as evidence that something unusual must have happened. It's not necessarily true, though. Sometimes an unresolved case can simply mean investigators never found enough information to determine what happened. At the same time, we don't think it's unreasonable to ask the question. The challenge is making sure that we're asking the right ones. Instead of starting with a theory and looking for evidence to support it, like what we talked about earlier, it's more productive to start with what facts are already known and what they're telling us about the environment and the circumstances and the limitations of the investigation that we're facing, and then move forward. That's where Nathan Campbell's case becomes valuable to the discussion. Not because it proves anything, not because it supports a particular theory, but because it reminds us how quickly certainty can disappear in the remote wilderness. As we continue through tonight's investigation, I want you to try to keep that idea in mind, because we're going to encounter it again and again. Whether we're talking about disappearances, encounters, reports, unusual sounds, or witness observations, one of them keeps resurfacing. The farther we move from the available evidence, the easier it becomes for the assumptions to make take their place. So, key takeaway from that is don't let focus on what's in front of you. Don't let your mind wander before you know what you're wandering off from.
Because if you've got evidence, you have to start with that.
Oh, absolutely. And the Campbell case is interesting because, this wasn't just some guy. This was a guy that knew what he was doing. By all means, an old hand. I mean, somebody that could handle himself in the backcountry. A guy not prone to making the mistakes that just your average person would make. So that's why a lot of these questions crop up, because there's a lot of questions here that are completely unanswerable because we weren't there when it happened. However, there is enough odd about this case to raise a lot of red flags. Could a bear have got him? Yes, absolutely, a bear could have gotten him, but he was prepared for that. He was not unarmed, so it doesn't rule out the possibility of a bear catching him asleep or something like that. But it does make it a much bigger question. A bear would have to get him unaware, because this was a guy who was used to defending himself in the woods. And when we start looking at the state of his campsite, the terrain he was in, it also adds in these factors because he knew his way in and out. He shouldn't have gotten lost. This was a guy who was prepared for his situation. So that's when this disappearance really starts getting odd.
And I think that's sometimes that there's so many people that go missing. I think when you get somebody like Campbell, sometimes it can get lost in the shuffle and just, it's just another person that was, that went missing in Denali. That's not really the case. It's not just another person. Like you said, it's an experienced person that probably shouldn't have been in that number of people. So there's the big questions. Okay, he was good. He did this before. He knew what he was doing. So what really happened? And I think that's where the spiral happens, and the doubt people start focusing too much on questions like that and the what ifs instead of circling. It's okay, like you said, it's okay to ask those questions, but you always have to circle back and look at, okay, I've asked this question. Now, what does the evidence I have tell me or show me that can help me answer that question? You ask the question and you go back and look what you got. You don't ask this question and then go to ask another question and then ask another question. Because if you just ask questions on questions on questions on questions, you get, like you said, you get further away from the actual, and that's what happens is people get so caught up on all that. Then before you know it, it's, who are we talking about again? What?
Absolutely.
And it's, you've lost sight of what you're actually even talking about.
Exactly. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour here, so we're going to have to step away for just a few minutes. But when we come back, we're going to shift gears a little bit. We spent most of the first hour talking about disappearances and how investigators evaluate the evidence and why Denali kept finding its way into our research. In the next hour, we're going to start looking at some of the encounter reports that helped put this region on our radar in the first place. We'll talk about witnesses reported being watched in remote wilderness areas, reports involving unusual sounds, and some reoccurring observations that have shown up often enough over the years that they deserve a closer look. So folks, you're listening to the Nightmare Hunters podcast. Stick around. We will be right back with you after a few messages from our sponsors.
The new book, How to Research a Haunted House by paranormal investigator Margie Kay and professional researcher Violet Wisdom is now available from Unex Media. This one-of-a-kind book explains how to do research on a house with uncommon methods and resources used by historic home researchers, and how to determine who may be doing the haunting and why. How to Research a Haunted House can be used by homeowners, renters, investors, and it should be in the library of all professional paranormal investigators. Get this unique book at unexmedia.com or amazon.com. That's unexmedia.com or amazon.com. 2026 is off to a great start, and it's almost time. With many exciting predictions and the recent emphasis on a potential major planetary event occurring in April, it promises to be a super transformational month, and we couldn't be more excited to be in Hawaii during this shift to integrate new frequencies. Folks, this will be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. April the 20th through the 24th, 2026, join us in Kona, Hawaii for Journey to Truth's very first vacation conference retreat. Enjoy 9 presenters over 5 days with ocean adventures with dolphins and whales and sacred sites and so much more. Experience Hawaii like never before. You will enjoy 5 days on the Big Island, so don't wait. Start planning your trip today at journeytotruth.online. That's journeytotruth.online. The paranormal field is changing, and now, more than ever, it's time for professionals to lead the way. Join the Oz Professional Paranormal Investigators Association, a global network of serious investigators dedicated to raising the standard of real paranormal research. Access professional certifications, advanced training, and courses exploring true investigation, psychic phenomena. If you're a real paranormal investigator, be a part of the group defining the future. Join today. Visit ozinstitute.org. That's ozinstitute.org.
Hey everybody, this is Kerry Pocket Dot Davis from Dark Angel Medical, and you are listening to DA Ex Machina with DA Roberts. You may recognize me or some of my products from Dark Angel Medical in some of the Apex Predator, Lakeview Man, and Wild Hunt books, and you can get those products at www.darkangelmedical.com, along with training classes on how to use those products and save a life. Shoot us an email at info@darkangelmedical.com and be the difference.
In a world where monsters still walk the earth, one author dares to face them. From the brutal cryptid horror of the Apex Predator series to the Ozark legends that stalk the night in Lakeview Man. From the elite warriors of codename Wild Hunt to the relentless investigations of the Nightmare Hunter and the frontier terror of Dark Frontiers. When the Dead Rise, the Ragnarok Rising Saga unleashes pure zombie apocalypse fury. And across the stars, war rages in the Lost Legion and Man's Marauders. And in the realm of myth and steel, the world of Vanguard calls to those born for legend. Cryptids, zombies, sci-fi warfare, epic fantasy. This is the universe of D.A. Roberts.
And we are back, folks. And we're just going to jump right back into this. Segment 4 is what we call the pyramid problem. One of the things we've learned over the years is that every mystery eventually develops a life of its own. It starts with a set of facts. Somebody asks a few reasonable questions, and before long, the story begins growing in directions that have very little to do with the original event. The Nathan Campbell case is a good example of that. If you spend any amount of time in the woods looking into disappearances, you'll eventually run into discussions about the so-called Alaskan Pyramid. And depending on who you talk to, it's supposedly an underground structure, a secret or a secret military organization or an energy source or an ancient construction project or about a dozen other things, depending on which version of the story somebody happens to believe. We did a show on that about 2 years ago, I believe, if you want to go back and check that out. Now, before anybody starts sending angry emails at me, that's not me discussing the story. It's me pointing out that most people believe this, that most people discussing it aren't actually talking about Nathan Campbell anymore. They're talking about something else entirely. And that's really what interested me. Not the pyramid itself, but the process. How does a missing persons case become attached to a completely different narrative? Because that's something we see over and over again. And it's not unique to Alaska. It isn't unique to cryptid research, and it's not unique to missing person investigations. People naturally seek explanations. When information is limited, we start filling in the blanks. Sometimes those explanations turn out to be correct, and sometimes they don't. The challenge is figuring out whether we're following evidence or following a story that's grown beyond the available evidence. And as I was researching this case, I kept coming back to a simple question. If we remove every theory, every rumor, every social media post, and every piece of speculation from the conversation, what are we really left with? We're left with a man who disappeared in a remote wilderness area. We're left with a search effort. We're left with a lot of unanswered questions, but everything beyond that requires evidence. That's not a criticism of the folks asking the questions. Asking questions is exactly what investigators are supposed to do. The problem begins is when a question quietly transforms into an assumption. One of the reasons we've always tried to approach these topics the way that we do is because theories have a way of becoming more popular than facts. A theory can spread around the internet in a matter of hours. Evidence takes time. Evidence requires patience. Evidence requires us to accept uncertainty when uncertainty is the honest answer. Mark Twain said it best: a lie can spread around the world before the truth can put its pants on. That's difficult for a lot of folks, though. Most of us would rather have an explanation we can point to than an unanswered question we have to live with. But the older I get, the more I've come to appreciate the value of just saying, I don't know. That's not a weakness. It's honesty. In fact, some of the best investigations begin with these 3 words: I don't know. The moment we convince ourselves we already know the answer, the investigation's over. That's one of the reasons I think the Nathan Campbell case is such a useful starting point for tonight's discussion. It forces us to confront the difference between evidence and speculation. And that's a distinction we're going to need as we move into the encounter reports. Because if we're going to have an honest conversation about unusual sightings, strange sounds, and recurring behaviors in Alaska, we have to apply the same standard to those reports that we already apply to everything else. The question isn't whether the theory sounds interesting. The question is whether the evidence supports it. And that's where the real work begins. Robbie, you want to go ahead and just jump us into the next section?
Yeah, we're in segment 5, right?
Right.
All right. So segment 5 is the other reports. So one of the reasons that we want to spend the first hour talking about disappearances before we go into encounters is because people often make the mistake of treating these as completely separate conversations. In reality, that's not how any of us ended up looking at them. The reason the encounter reports became part of this investigation wasn't because DA set out to look at Bigfoot sightings in Alaska. It's just what happened was much simpler than that. Is he began researching disappearances, looking at maps, reading historical accounts, examining terrain features, and eventually he ran across an encounter report from the same region. He didn't pay too much attention to it at first. Because it was just a correlation. It's not a causation, and that's a big difference. It's not the report didn't cause, or the sighting didn't cause the report. It just happened to be in the same area. Wasn't that the case, DA? That it's just minor formality that it happened to be right there in the same spot. So just because 2 things happen in the same area doesn't mean that they're connected.
Right. It's like saying you saw Bigfoot near an oil well. It doesn't mean Bigfoot was pumping oil.
Exactly. Curious? Yeah. But does it necessarily mean it's connected? No. But the problem is, and this is where DA started really getting the gears started turning is it kept happening. Once or twice you can look and say, well, that's just coincidence, happenstance. But when it keeps turning up again and again and again, that's when, it's the nature of the beast, the job that DA and I did is that makes you curious. That makes you want to start looking into things a little bit more. So what do you think DA did? He started researching. And this is where he really started taking his deep dive into Alaska. And the funny thing, the more he researched Alaska, the more often he found himself running into reports from hunters, guides, bush pilots, trappers, and outdoorsmen who described experiences they couldn't easily explain. Some of those reports were probably misidentifications. Some were likely the result of distance or weather or lighting conditions or simple mistakes. And that's true of any of the category of eyewitness testimony. At the same time, some of these reports contain details that were difficult to dismiss entirely. And I think, that's kind of been a running theme the past 3 or 4 months on the shows. We've kind of really hammered that home of, okay, some of these things can be explained. Some of these things can be this, but some of these things you can't just say, oh, well, that was just this.
Especially when patterns emerge.
Yep. And we've really hammered patterns and recognition and things like that home here lately. And I think maybe that was building towards this. So one of the things that he learned over the years of is that both of us have learned this from witness testimony is witnesses' testimony should neither be blindly accepted nor automatically rejected. And just because somebody says, "Hey, I was there and I saw it," that doesn't mean that what they saw was exactly what happened. Because you can line up 5 people and have somebody run from left to right in front of them and say, okay, and go to each and every one of them and say, tell me what you just saw. And you'll have 5 different descriptions of height, what the guy was wearing, if it was a guy or not, if it was a girl, what color he was. You don't tell me anything. You just say, tell me what you saw. You'll have that many different descriptions because some people may not be fully colorblind, but they may be partially colorblind. And what this person he or sees as blue, this person may see as gray.
My son Nick's got a friend who can't see the color red.
See, does that mean that person's wrong? No, that's their interpretation of it. So that's kind of what DA said is you can't blindly accept it because you don't. This is where you qualify. And if you ever heard that word, you qualify. That's a word in court. I have to qualify the witness. And the reason they do that, you've seen it on many a video. They're asking a bunch of questions and people are like, what in the world's that got to do with anything that's got to do with the case? Well, it may not, but they're qualifying questions and they're like, it's the attorney trying to say if the person knows what they're talking about or not.
Right.
And they're building that. It's like the neurolinguistic programming that DA and I talk about all the time. We do the same thing. We ask, we sit there and qualify the person we're talking to, get a read on them, get a baseline before we ask these other questions, because that's how you do this kind of stuff. So you don't just accept on face value what somebody says, because they could have astigmatism. They could have a short attention span and only, just.
They could be making it up.
Exactly. I wasn't going to go there, but yes, that's possible.
Well, we did a whole show on hoaxes, so
yeah,
I might as well go there.
So sorry, I went off on a tangent and lost my spot.
Oh, you're fine.
So if you believe every story you hear, you'll eventually find yourself defending things that clearly aren't true. We've seen that happen many, many times. If you dismiss every eyewitness out of hand, though, you can miss out on potentially valuable information. We talked about that earlier. The challenge is figuring out which reports deserve the additional attention and which don't. So when we look at an encounter report, we usually start with the witness thing, and a lot of times we'll have discussions back and forth before it even makes it on the show. Of, well, what'd you? And here again is the exact same thing, because I may read a report and take one thing from it, and DA might take another thing from it, and then Doc and Steve may take something totally different because of their backgrounds. And
which is why we compare notes at the end of the day.
Exactly, because it's just no one person is going to get every single thing correctly. So we usually start with the witnesses. Who are they? How familiar are they with the environment? How much time did they spend observing what they claim to have seen? Were they close enough to make a reliable observation? Are they describing what they actually observed, or are they jumping straight into a conclusion? Those questions matter to us, because if somebody automatically just jumps into, well, I was walking in the woods and I saw Bigfoot. Okay, well, what makes you think you saw Bigfoot? There's a distinction there between I was walking through the woods and I saw Bigfoot, and I was walking through the woods and then suddenly I saw something that I wasn't quite sure what it was. See, it can end up at the same place, but the person who says, I was walking through the woods and I saw something I wasn't quite sure what it was, that tells me that person stopped and they were looking and they were wondering what it was. So they were being observant.
Right.
But somebody that says, I was walking through the woods and I saw Bigfoot. Now, does that necessarily mean this person is jumping to conclusion, making things up? No. Some people, that's just their way. That goes back to the qualifying them, feeling them out, asking questions, and getting to know that. So, but anyway, that's how you start with stuff like that. So that's one of the reasons the reports we're discussing that have caught our attention, is they weren't coming from people wandering through the woods for the first time. Many of them came from individuals who spent a significant portion of their lives outdoors. People who knew the difference between a bear and a moose. People who understood terrain, distance, movement, and animal behavior. Again, that doesn't make them infallible, but it does make them a little bit more, I don't want to use the word trustworthy, but it makes them a little bit more dependable on if they know what they're talking about. And, if you say, did you see that whatever animal over there, and for a fact that animal doesn't exist, and they're like, oh yeah, I saw a bunch of them over there, and that animal doesn't live in Alaska.
I got a report not too long ago of an old boy that said he saw Bigfoot while driving home from work, and he was convinced that's what it was. So me and Noah drove out there. It's out on the south side of town. Next time you're here, Robbie, I'll take you over there and show it. There's a house that sets back in a stand of trees, and this old boy bought a wooden Bigfoot carving and stuck it in his front yard. And when you drive by, if you just catch a glimpse of it, it'll freak you out.
Just like that one I told you that guy's got, that I see every day when I go to work. Yeah. And I can imagine, especially at night, if you're driving by and you're not really paying attention to the side of the road, just as you go by, you see something like that. I can see that.
Catch that in the edge of your headlights as you're going by.
Yeah. So, like I said, that doesn't make them infallible. But what it does mean is that when they describe something unusual, it's worth listening to what they have to say before deciding what happened. And that goes back to what I said earlier of asking those qualifying questions, getting to know this person a little bit, figuring out, are they just somebody they just jump right into it. They're just excited, and or are they, like I said, somebody who says, I saw something and I'm not sure what it was. To me, that shows somebody who's being observant. That shows somebody who wants to know what's around them and wants to figure it out, and is not just prone to say, it was this or it was that. They took the time to actually look at it. So as we continued looking at the reports from the Denali region and the broader Alaska range, we started noticing something interesting. The encounters themselves varied quite a bit, but certain behaviors seemed to repeat itself. And here we go talking about this again, because we've had several shows on these behaviors and things like that keep showing up and repeating themselves. Witnesses describe being watched. Now, where have we seen that before? They described unusual sounds. They described seeing something that appeared obvious one moment and impossible to relocate the next. How many times have we seen that about the way they move and these things just
The Paul Freeman footage.
Yeah, exactly. So stuff like that is some of the stuff that caught DA's attention, obviously, because we look at that stuff all the time. And so, which means now we're not just talking about isolated stories, we're talking about recurring observations. Whenever multiple witnesses begin describing similar behaviors, it's worth slowing down and taking a closer look. And that's where we're headed next. Instead of focusing on what people think they saw, let's spend some time looking at what they reported experiencing, because that distinction matters. Because if we're going to learn anything useful from these reports, the behaviors are far more important than the conclusions.
Absolutely. So for you, does experience in the wilderness increase a witness's credibility? Like, say, a guy who's a park ranger versus a guy who grew up in New York City and never stepped into the woods.
Not offhand, it doesn't. I mean, it helps, but just because somebody is experienced in the wilderness, that doesn't mean, because you could be experienced in the wilderness in one area. I could be experienced in the wilderness here in South Carolina. Is that going to translate to Alaska?
No, not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Because they got a lot of animals up there we don't have down here.
Right. And, how harsh is my winter here versus what it would be up there? So just, could I survive? Yes, I feel like I could. But offhand, just because I have wilderness and outdoor experience doesn't mean that I know everything I need to know about Alaska.
Right.
Same. So yes, it's going to make me think, okay, this person has a potential to be a very credible witness, but that doesn't mean that, like you said, I'm not going to blindly accept anything they say just because I know they know what they're doing.
Right.
Because I know plenty of people who are good at their jobs that don't know whether to wind their ass or scratch their watch.
Yeah. So when taking a report, let's say specifically taking a cryptid report, what are some of the key things you specifically look for in the report?
Well, like what we talked about, how long did they observe it? What was the distance? What was, was it moving parallel or what was the orientation of them versus what they were looking at? Was it moving towards them? Was it moving away from them? Was it moving across their view? What time of day was it? What was the weather condition? What was, was it roadside? Was it in the deep woods? Was it kind of in that transition point? Just, there's so many things that, like we've talked about before, so many things that can affect what somebody sees, because like we've talked about, lighting plays a big role in what you see. So does obstruction. So does, if you were in a car and moving at highway speeds or whatever, a 2-second view of something in a car at highway speeds is vastly different than a 2-second view of something if you're standing still.
Yeah.
So
the way I take reports has changed a lot over the years. Used to, I focused primarily on physical description. I want to know how tall it was, what color it was, how long the stride was, how wide its shoulders were, how big do you think the feet were? Those were the details I used to focus on. but I still take those details. Don't get me wrong, because those are factors you want to pay attention to because it can help you build, whether they saw the same creature in another county over that kind of thing. But I spend a lot more time talking about behavior now. How did it walk? What did it do when it was watching you? What was it doing when you saw it? That kind of thing. Because I think the behaviors are now especially. I wish I could have told myself this 25 years ago, but I think the behaviors are just as important as the physical description, if maybe not more so. Because the behaviors are what we use to develop the patterns.
But 25 years ago, you didn't know that.
Right. But I wish I could have told myself.
Right.
I would have a lot more detailed notes than I have now.
But I mean, that there's always going to be something because, in 10, 15 years from now, you're going to be saying, well, I wish I'd known that 10, 15 years ago.
Right.
So, but that's part of it is evolving and learning the process and learning, what works and what doesn't work. I mean,
right.
Because, just like you asked me, and we were focusing on two completely different sets of data points, but that doesn't mean either one of the data points are any less important than the other.
Exactly.
Because what you were talking about is, really important because you were focusing on creates the overall picture of what the creature is and what it was doing. Whereas mine focuses on, okay, is there anything that could have obstructed the view, altered the view, all that kind of stuff. So, but when you put both of those both of those sets of data points together, if you just took your data points from that, or if we interviewed the same witnesses and you talked about that and you just took your data points, you might have, a glimpse. And I did the same thing. I might just have a glimpse, but you take both those sets of data points and put them together, and what kind of a picture are you looking at then?
Right. I mean, every piece of information we can gather is another data point, and those data points allow us to put to build a profile, and the profile is really what's going to help us understand these. I took an encounter from a guy in the Mark Twain who was convinced that he'd seen a Bigfoot, and I was excited to talk to the guy. And I said, "What were you doing?" He said, "I was picking wild blackberries." And we know that a lot of encounter stories happen around these berry patches. So I get my notebook out. I'm like super excited. I said, "Well, what did you tell me exactly what you saw?" He goes, "Well, it was big." I said, "How big?" He goes, "Oh, it's probably my height." I'm like, "Okay, it's absolutely possible. It could be a juvenile Bigfoot that could be around 5 to 6 feet tall." I said, "Okay, what did you actually see?" He goes, "Well, I was looking at it through a bunch of the berry patch. I could see it on the other side, kind of moving." I said, "Well, tell me exactly what you saw." He goes, "Well, I saw a Bigfoot getting berries." I said, "Okay, describe it physically for me and tell me how it was picking the berries." He goes, "Well, it was kind of shuffling back and forth. I could tell that it had black fur, and it was grabbing the berries with its mouth." And I went, "Black bear." Immediately, black bear. If he'd have said it was using its hands, black bears don't do that. But when him saying it wasn't using its hands at all, it was standing up and grabbing berries with its mouth. I'm like, I think you saw a bear.
Yep. As soon as you said getting berries with its mouth, that's exactly what I was like.
He had an obstructed view. He just saw something broad, covered in black hair that he couldn't clearly see, picking berries.
I've seen them do that. I've seen black bears stand up on their hind leg and
get them top berries, man.
Get them top berries off the top of the bush.
Yeah, if he'd said it was using hands, would have been a whole different report. But the fact that it was picking the berries with its mouth and eating them as it picked them, I said that's a great sighting. I'm glad you reported this, but I would be willing to bet that was a black bear.
And I bet he argued, no, I know what I saw.
Now he was still convinced it was a Bigfoot, but yeah, I still went ahead and wrote down the report and his information and even the area where he got it. But there are black bears in the Mark Twain. We've seen black bears in the Mark Twain, but the fact that it was shuffling around, it wasn't taking big steps, and it wasn't using its its hands at all. The fact that it was picking berries with its mouth, I'm like, yeah, that's a bear. But yeah, let's go ahead and jump into the next section uh, as we get into more of these behaviors. Segment 6 is about the watchers. One of the things that has always caught my attention as we started digging through these encounter reports from Alaska wasn't necessarily that the wilderness claimed to have seen. Wasn't necessarily what they was claimed to have seen. It was something that often happened before the sighting ever occurred. A surprising number of witnesses described becoming aware of something before they actually observed it. Sometimes they describe that feeling of being watched. Sometimes they describe noticing movement where they didn't expect it. And sometimes they can't immediately identify what caught their attention, only that something caused them to stop and look around. Now, I realize that's a slippery subject because human beings are pattern recognition machines. That's why pareidolia exists. We constantly scan our environment looking for threats, movement, and anything that seems out of place. Well, some of us do. Sometimes we're right. Sometimes we're wrong. Anybody who spent enough time in the woods knows that your imagination can get the better of you, especially when visibility is limited and you're operating in unfamiliar terrain. And at the same time, it's difficult to ignore how often this particular observation appears in witness reports. One report that caught my attention involved an experienced hunting guide operating in Alaska. This wasn't somebody unfamiliar with the wilderness. This was a person who spent a significant amount of time in the remote areas and made his living off the outdoors. According to the report, he observed a large, dark figure through a spotting scope from a considerable distance. What interested me wasn't really the description itself. What interested me was the amount of time involved. We're not talking a brief glimpse through the trees. We're talking about an observation that reportedly lasted long enough for the witness to study its movement, its posture, and behavior over an extended period of time. Whether the witness correctly identified what he saw is almost secondary to the point I'm making. The important question is why reports like this continue to appear. One of the things I've often asked myself when reading witness statements is whether the behavior being described is more important than the object being observed. For example, if 10 witnesses describe 10 different creatures, that may not tell us very much at all. But if 10 witnesses describe the same behavior, that's a totally different conversation. And as I continued reviewing reports from Alaska and even other areas, eventually became part of the zone theory. One behavior kept appearing often enough that it became difficult to ignore. Observation. Witnesses repeatedly described situations where they felt as though something was aware of them long before they became aware of it. Now, there are plenty of conventional explanations for that. Humans are naturally sensitive to environmental changes. We notice when the woods go quiet. We notice movement in our peripheral vision. We notice when something feels different, even if we can't immediately explain why. Those are all perfectly reasonable possibilities. The question I keep coming back to is whether that's the entire explanation. Because when you read enough reports, you start finding situations where experienced outdoorsmen describe remarkably similar experiences despite having no connection to one another. Again, it's not really proof of anything, but it is an observation. One of the reasons I think this category of report is important is because it shifts the focus away from the creature and toward the behavior. Instead of asking whether somebody saw a Bigfoot, we're asking why witnesses repeatedly describe being observed before the encounter even occurred. That's a much more interesting question. It's also a question that can be investigated. Because the one moment we stop arguing about labels and start looking at the behaviors, patterns become easier to identify. And once patterns start emerging, that's when things really start getting interesting. Robbie, why do you think that so many witnesses describe becoming aware of something before seeing it? And as I know, you had the exact experience. You knew you were being watched before you knew it was there.
Well, like I said, if you're somebody who,
everybody I think can have that awareness. It's just whether you've turned it on or not, I think. And
Right.
if you're somebody that's, what do we say all the time? If you're situationally aware and you're somebody who constantly does that, I think it's a lot easier for that to happen. It's, like I said, when Jessica was out and I were out there, and we both were just like looking over each other's shoulders at the same time, saying, "There's something over your shoulder. There's something over your shoulder." We both just like instantly knew, but we've spent so much time. We're out in the woods, you know. Same thing with you and I when we've been out there, and it's just unless you've had that feeling, it's hard to explain in words how it works. It's just it works. I mean,
Exactly.
I know that's so cliche to say it that way, but there's really no other way to say it. Everybody, I think, can be that way. It's just you have to train yourself to just be aware. If that makes sense, but I mean,
Well, it's kind of like, for example, this behavior drives my wife and my son crazy. I've been out of law enforcement 6 years now, give or take. I will still drive down the road while we're in traffic and go, expired tag, temporary tag's out of date. I can't help it. I just notice it. And my wife's like, why do you still pay attention to that? I'm like, because I can't flip that switch back off once it's on.
Yep. Well, it's just like, I hadn't worked K9 in probably double the amount of time it's been since you've been out of law enforcement, because I've been an SRO for going on almost 17 years now. 17 out of my 30-year career has been in the school, but I can still drive down the road and see a car. It's like, oh, but there's dope in that car. It's just because that's what I did when I had the dog, and right before is, I just you know what I'm talking about. You get that.
That's a car that's got 37 air fresheners hanging from the.
Yeah. That would be what we call a clue.
Okay, but here's a question for you. As an investigator, and I don't just necessarily mean a law enforcement investigator, I mean the field time we've spent out in the woods together. How critical do you think situational awareness is to catching observations?
I mean, me personally, I think it's extremely critical to it, but in reality, do you have to have that to be able to go out and be a good field investigator with that? No. But I think it helps tremendously, because if you're aware of your surroundings and situationally aware, you're going to pick up on things that you wouldn't pick up on if you're just out just tooling around, just
But some people have completely lost their situational awareness. Their face is always in a cell phone. They could run into Bigfoot's chest, mumble "excuse me," and turn and walk away without ever looking to see what they walked into.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, I guess that it's like, when you go into a restaurant. Oh, yeah, and me, you, and Doc have done it. All of us kind of jockeying for who's going to have to sit with their back to the door. I mean,
each one of us is watching an exit.
Yeah, and sometimes it's kind of can be a comical situation because you're like, it's almost like flipping a coin. Dang it, I got to do it this time. If we get, but it's good when you got somebody, or when you're out with somebody who's you trust and is just as prepared as you are. But then when you get out with somebody who's not, and you're like, oh, now I only got to watch out for myself. I got to watch out for this person too, because you've been out with people that you just are like, man, listen.
I've gone out with some folks that I'm like, man, I'm glad I got this guy with me. And I've gone out with a few other people. I've been like, this person shouldn't have a firearm.
So, like I said, it's not a necessity, but it is in my book, because I think if you're not situationally aware, number one, I think eventually you're going to end up getting hurt
Right.
because you're going to be not, and that's a twofold thing. I mean, you have to be able to disconnect yourself from what you're, like you said with the phone. Huh? Excuse me, you can't get so engrossed in what you're looking at or what you're watching on the ground, the footprint or whatever you're looking at, to miss what's hanging in the tree over top of your head.
Right. And that's one of the things we always stress, look left, right, and up whenever you're moving. Watch your feet because of the nope ropes.
Yep.
But as like, let's say, for example, we've got some folks who are listening who are wanting to get into investigating on their own. What would be one of the best bits of advice you could give them about what other explanations they should consider before they start drawing conclusions?
Well, I mean, just like we always try to find what else in nature that we know that it could be before we ever. I mean, case in point, we've told the story when we were out there looking at something walking across the current coming towards us. We're having the discussion amongst the four of us. Well, could that be a raccoon standing on top of a log?
Nope,
Well,
it's moving against the current,
moving
coming
against the
right at
current.
us.
Well, could that be a log out there with? Nope, it's moving against the current. Well, nope, it's got eye shine when flashlights. But that's the point is, even this thing walking across the current coming at us in, what would you say, by 35 degree or mile per hour current at least?
Yeah, a strong current because the river was up.
And this thing was head and shoulders above the river, which according to DA was probably at least what, 9
at that point,
10 feet deep.
Probably in that ballpark, at least 8, maybe more.
So, but we're still having the discussion of, well, could that be this?
And all the while, Doc's going, Robbie, get in the truck. Robbie, get in the truck.
And all the while, I'm walking closer to it. We were going to have a discussion of the minds, a meeting in the middle.
But that's that's a perfect example. We were asking, even at the time, we were asking what else could it be before we immediately, because we all could have just done the Scooby-Doo Bigfoot at the same time, but we didn't do that. Is that a bear in the water? No.
Well,
a black bear in Missouri ain't gonna be tall enough to ride that current. He's gonna get swept down river. It's not a log because it's moving.
Think about it. We had that conversation. Then we realized that it was coming towards us. We said, okay, it's time to unask the AO. We get in the car, we take off. Doc does his J-turn in that big Wagoneer. We get up to the edge of the road, and we all start thinking, maybe we need to go back down there and look and see. Well, we ain't really sure we saw what we saw. Let's go back. What'd we do? We went back, and of course I get out again and go walking off towards it again, and it turns around because it was going back the other way. Turns around and comes back at us again. So same behavior that we observed, repeatable behavior, did the exact same thing.
Yeah. Well, let's start talking about sounds. You want to take us into the next segment, talk about sounds?
All right, segment 7, the sounds. And, this is something that's always kind of fascinated DA and I both. Whether you're talking about the Sierra sounds or the Ohio growls or
even that one that was recorded down by you.
Yeah. Because there's something about it when you hear something like that and the wildlife in your area and you hit that mental Rolodex and you can't identify what you're hearing. It doesn't match anything that you're familiar with. That's fascinating to me. So but the encounter reports is how often people become focused on what they saw while completely overlooking what they heard. You know, you sometimes you have to drag stuff like that out of them. And that's understandable because it can be a traumatic experience. And, you know, humans are visual creatures. So auditory responses sometimes are not high on our list of priorities. You know, I've done it before. What'd you see? He came in here, he did this, he grabbed her, he took off, and he did this, did it. Oh, well, did he say anything? What? The guy when he ran in here and he hit her, did he say anything? Well, he was wearing it, you know, and you know, you do some investigation, come to find out the guy walked in or ran in and said, and smacked her and said, I'm gonna kill every one of y'all or something. You know, it's just people, but sometimes people just don't key in on that because we're more visually, and I think that's a lot of reason pareidolia is so, I don't want to say rampant, but it's so prevalent. It's just because we are visual. When somebody has an unusual experience, the first thing that most people want to do is know what it looked like. How tall was it? Was it dark? Was it covered in hair? How far away was it? Those questions naturally dominate the conversation. We just brought some of those up not more than 5 minutes ago. What often gets overlooked is that many encounters begin with sound rather than sight. In some cases, witnesses never see anything at all. They hear something, then they spend the rest of their lives trying to figure out what made it. So we kept digging into these reports from Alaska, and one of those things that was noticed was witnesses frequently describe sounds that they couldn't identify. Sometimes they sound like vocalization. Sometimes they sounded mechanical. Sometimes they sounded like something striking wood or stone or another hard surface. So before anybody jumps to conclusions on unusual sounds occurring in the wilderness all the time, trees crack, rocks shift, animals make noises that most people never hear because they spend very little time in these remote areas. Anybody who spent enough nights in the woods knows that nature can produce some very strange sounds. That being said, there are certain descriptions that seem to appear repeatedly. One report that caught DA's attention involves the same experienced hunting guide that we discussed earlier. Prior to discovering unusual tracks, he described hearing a sharp sound that reminded him of two rocks being struck together. It was distinctive enough that it stayed with him for long after the experience ended. Now, by itself, that doesn't prove anything. The important thing is not the sound itself, it's the pattern. As DA continued to look into this and look through the reports from Alaska and other regions, he found similar descriptions appearing again and again. Sometimes witnesses describe wood knocks, sometimes they describe clacks, sometimes they describe pops. Terminology varied, but the general theme remained surprisingly consistent. That observation eventually led us to one of the discussions that we've had on previous episodes, the tongue pop theory. Yep. Now, before we go any further, I want to make it clear, tongue pop theory is exactly what the name suggests. It's a theory. It's not a proven fact, and it's not an established biological behavior. It's an attempt to explain a recurring category of witness observation. Basic idea is fairly simple. Many people assume that every unusual sound reported in the wilderness must involve knocking on trees, striking objects together, or some form of external sound production. The question we started asking was whether some of those reports might have had a biological origin instead. Could certain sounds be produced by the animal itself? Could witnesses be describing a vocal or oral behavior that they were interpreting as a knock, pop, or clack because they don't have a better frame of reference? That's an interesting question because it changes how we evaluate the reports. Instead of asking what object created the sound, we're asking whether the witness correctly identified the source. And that's a much more difficult question to answer. One of the things that we noticed over the years is that people tend to describe unfamiliar sounds using familiar language. If you've never heard something before, your brain immediately starts comparing it to things you already know. A witness might describe a sound as a knock because that's the closest comparison available. Another witness might call the sound a pop, and someone else might describe it as a clack. The terminology changes, but the underlying observation may be very similar. Again, we're not suggesting that every unusual sound reported in the wilderness can be explained as a tongue pop theory, or can be explained by the tongue pop theory. That would just be as irresponsible as dismissing every report outright.
Well, I think the tongue pop theory does provide a very valid idea, because I can make multiple different sounds with that tongue pop, depending on how I position my mouth, how far I open it. And you've seen firsthand. I can do it loud enough it'll echo across the lake or down an entire valley, and that's just me. When imagine something 4 times my body mass.
Yep. Oh, I agree too. But for purposes, we have to say that we're not. I 100% agree with you that I think this. I think that's. I'd say at least 75% of what is heard out there is probably that.
Yeah.
And that might be a conservative estimate. It may be more than that, but I think that's right. Reasonable to say that it's that high of a percentage. What we're suggesting is that recurring sounds deserve to be examined more carefully because communication is one of the most important behaviors of any species, or that any species possesses. If we're looking for patterns, communication is exactly where we should be paying attention. The more we thought about it, the more we realize that sound may be actually tell us more than the sightings. A sighting may be misidentified, a track may be mismeasured, and a memory can fade over time. Behavior tends to be more consistent, though. And communication is behavior. That's one of the reasons this category of reports continues to hold our attention. Not because it answers questions, but because it creates better ones.
I'm going to jump right into the next segment because we've got about 10 minutes before we've got to pause for commercial. The next segment is called the Vanishing Act, and this is another observed behavior. One of our observations that eventually led us to discussing adaptive camouflage wasn't a single sighting report. It was the fact that witnesses from different parts of the country often described a remarkably similar experience. They would see something, they would focus on it, they'd attempt to maintain visual contact, and then suddenly it was gone. Now, on the surface, that may not sound unusual. Anybody who spends enough time in the woods knows how easy it is to lose sight of an animal. Deer do it all the time. Bear do it. Coyotes do it. A person can watch an animal walk behind a stand of trees and completely lose track of them. The wilderness is full of visual obstacles. But what caught our attention wasn't the witness lost sight of something. It was how often they described the experience. Many reports follow a similar pattern. Witness sees the subject clearly enough to identify movement, shape, posture, or direction of travel, like the Paul Freeman footage. They look away briefly, reposition themselves, or attempt to improve their vantage point, and when they look back, it's gone. Again, that's not necessarily unusual. The question becomes whether or not the witness should reasonably have expected to maintain visual contact. That's where things get interesting. One of the mistakes people make when discussing reports like these is assuming there are only 2 possibilities. Either the witness is telling the truth and saw exactly what they claim, or the witness is mistaken. The reality is usually a bit more complicated than that. A witness can be completely honest and still misinterpret what happened, like the guy that pointed the statue over on the south side of town. At the same time, a witness can accurately describe an event while reaching the wrong conclusion about what caused it, like the guy picking berries. He was convinced he saw a Bigfoot, but it was a black bear. Those distinctions do matter. And as I continued looking at the reports from Alaska and other regions, I became increasingly interested in the role that terrain plays in these observations. Dense vegetation, broken topography, shadows, elevation changes, lighting conditions, and natural cover all create opportunities for something to just disappear from view much quicker than most people realize. But that's just one possible explanation. Another possibility is behavior. If an animal spends its entire life avoiding detection, we would expect it to be exceptionally good at using the terrain, the vegetation, shadows, and movement to remain concealed. In fact, we'd expect that behavior regardless of what species we're talking about. The better an animal becomes at avoiding observation, the fewer opportunities people have to observe it. That's not controversial, that's just biology. What eventually led us to discussing adaptive camouflage was the realization that many witnesses seemed to be describing the same outcome, even when the circumstances changed. Something visible became difficult to see. Something obvious became difficult to relocate. Something appeared exposed suddenly, then seemed to blend in the environment. Now, when people hear the phrase adaptive camouflage, they usually jump straight to science fiction. They start talking about invisibility, cloaking devices, or creatures disappearing into the thin air. But that's never been what we've been talking about. What we're discussing is the possibility that some animals may possess physical characteristics that make visual detection far more difficult than observers realize. Much like the Paul Freeman footage. He's filming a large dark-colored Sasquatch. It moves in front of a tree, stops, stands still, and just disappears. And as he gets closer, it starts moving again, and bang, there it is. Scotty didn't beam it up. It didn't pop into another dimension temporarily. It just blended in perfectly with its environment. And when it started moving, there it was again. One of the theories we've discussed involves transparent or translucent hair shafts. And if such characteristics exist, which we've shown pictures, Doug Hychek from Monster Quest has shown pictures of clear hair shaft. Investigators from Florida to Alaska have found clear hair shafts. But it could potentially affect how light interacts with the animal's outline under certain conditions. It's a hypothesis. It's not proof. It isn't established science. It's an attempt to explain a reoccurring observation, and I think it makes the most logical sense. The important thing is not the explanation itself, though. The important thing is the pattern that led us to ask that question. Why do so many witnesses describe the same general experience? And that's where I think the real value lies. Whether adaptive camouflage ultimately proves correct, proves partially correct, or proves completely wrong, the reports themselves still exist. The witnesses are still describing something the challenge is determining what that something might be. As investigators, I think it's our responsibility to examine the behavior before we become attached to an explanation. The behavior is observable. The explanation is a theory. Those are not the same things. But again, the clear hair shaft, the blending ability, that's a working theory. We don't present that as being everything. We don't say this explains it, but from a scientific standpoint, it makes the most sense. Polar bears have clear air shafts. Part of the undercoat of wolves have certain clear hair shafts. A lot of animals have clear hair shafts interspersed in their coats. Even deer do to an extent. But here's the thing. What does that clear hair shaft really do? And we've discussed this before. The military is using clear fiber optic strands in their latest generation of ghillie suits. Why? Because that clear shaft absorbs and redirects the color of light around it. It's not invisibility. It's simply if they're laying in something green, it appears green. If they're laying in something desert tan, it appears tan. That's what those clear hair shafts do. And to me, that is a real-world explanation on why something like in the Paul Freeman footage, it walks over, stops in front of a tree, and seems to just vanish from sight. Robbie, anything you want to add to that?
I think you pretty well covered it. I mean, we've talked extensively about adaptive camouflage, and I just think it's something that I think it's finally starting to catch on because we've had this discussion. We think there's a few larger shows than us out there that are all of a sudden starting to show
Like
the same.
the Teddy Roosevelt theory, the clear hair
Yeah.
shaft, the tongue pops.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a lot of theories that we kind of pioneered.
Yeah. That are suddenly becoming mainstream on some of these bigger channels.
Yeah. But we're going to have to take another short break here, but stick with us because when we come back, we're going to start bringing these pieces together. We've talked about disappearances, encounter reports, observation behavior, unusual sounds, visual concealment, and even movement corridors. And we're going to get back into that too. In the last hour, we're going to look at where these data sets overlap and what, if anything, we can reasonably conclude from the information we've examined tonight. You're listening to the Nightmare Hunters podcast, and we will be right back after these messages from our sponsors.
In a world where monsters still walk the earth, one author dares to face them. From the brutal cryptid horror of the Apex Predator series to the Ozark legends that stalk the night in Lakeview Man. From the elite warriors of codename Wild Hunt to the relentless investigations of the Nightmare Hunter and the frontier terror of Dark Frontiers. When the Dead Rise, the Ragnarok Rising saga unleashes pure zombie apocalypse fury. And across the stars, war rages in the Lost Legion and man's marauders. And in the realm of myth and steel, the world of Vanguard calls to those born for legend. Cryptids, zombies, sci-fi warfare, epic fantasy. This is the universe of D.A. Roberts. The new book, How to Research a Haunted House by paranormal investigator Margie Kay and professional researcher Violet Wisdom, is now available from Unex Media. This one-of-a-kind book explains how to do research on a house with uncommon methods and resources used by historic home researchers, and how to determine who may be doing the haunting and why. How to Research a Haunted House can be used by homeowners, renters, investors, and it should be in the library of all professional paranormal investigators. Get this unique book at unexmedia.com or amazon.com. That's unexmedia.com or amazon.com. 2026 is off to a great start, and it's almost time. With many exciting predictions and the recent emphasis on a potential major planetary event occurring in April, it promises to be a super transformational month. And we couldn't be more excited to be in Hawaii during this shift to integrate new frequencies. Folks, this will be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. April the 20th through the 24th, 2026. Join us in Kona, Hawaii for Journey to Truth's very first vacation conference retreat. Enjoy 9 presenters over 5 days with ocean adventures with dolphins and whales and sacred sites and so much more. Experience Hawaii like never before. You will enjoy 5 days on the Big Island, so don't wait. Start planning your trip today at journeytotruth.online. That's journeytotruth.online. The paranormal field is changing, and now, more than ever, it's time for professionals to lead the way. Join the Oz Professional Paranormal Investigators Association, a global network of serious investigators dedicated to raising the standard of real paranormal research. Access professional certifications, advanced training, and courses exploring true investigation, psychic phenomena. If you're a real paranormal investigator, be a part of the group defining the future. Join today. Visit ozinstitute.org. That's ozinstitute.org.
Hey everybody, this is Kerry Pocket Dot Davis from Dark Angel Medical, and you are listening to DA Ex Machina with DA Roberts. You may recognize me or some of my products from Dark Angel Medical in some of the Apex Predator, Lakeview Man, and Wild Hunt books, and you can get those products at www.darkangelmedical.com, along with training classes on how to use those products and save a life. Shoot us an email at info@darkangelmedical.com and be the difference.
And we are back, folks. Thank you guys for sticking with us. Robbie, if you need to crash out, that is perfectly okay, brother. I can handle it.
I'm probably gonna have to here. And if I hadn't had to stay up and watch Jason's thing last night, I probably would have been a lot better. But
No worries, man. I can handle this.
so you ready for me to jump into number 9 though?
Yeah, go right ahead.
All right, segment 9, the corridor. One of the things that we've tried to emphasize throughout tonight's discussion is that individual reports can be misleading. A single sighting doesn't necessarily tell us much. Single disappearances may or may not be significant. Even recurring behavior can be difficult to evaluate if they're examined in isolation. What becomes interesting is when multiple categories of reports begin appearing in the same environment. That's where we return to the idea of the corridors. The longer that DA researched Alaska, the more he found himself paying attention to the terrain, the features, rather than the individual stories. At first, he began looking at the reports, and eventually he started looking into the common geography. Where these things happen, what did those locations have in common? Were the reoccurring environmental features that what were the reoccurring environmental features that kept reoccurring, regardless of type of the report being examined? Those questions eventually became some of the most important questions in this entire investigation. One of the things that stands out in the Denali region is the number of natural travel routes that exist throughout the landscape. River valleys create movement corridors. Drainage creates movement corridors. Bridge systems create movement corridors. Animals use them. Humans use them. In many cases, the terrain itself encourages movement through specific areas, and that shouldn't surprise anybody. The easiest route through a difficult terrain is usually the route everything uses. What interested us so much about is how often these reports seem to cluster around those features. The Nathan Campbell case involved a remote region connected to waterways and natural travel routes. The guide reported, as we discussed earlier, involved movement through terrain that naturally channels travel. Many encounter reports occurred near waterways, valleys, transition zones, and areas where movement becomes predictable. Again, that's not evidence of anything extraordinary. It's evidence that geography matters. One of the reasons that DA became increasingly interested in this behavioral analysis is because behavior often follows terrain. Animals move through landscapes in predictable ways. Human beings do the same thing. If we want to understand why reports appear where they do, we need to understand how movement occurs within those environments. This is where I think a lot of discussions go wrong. People become so focused on what they think they're looking for that they stop paying attention to what to where they're looking. And I think I said something about that earlier, is asking this question, then asking the next question, and instead of circling back to what you've got. Terrain matter, location matters, and terrain matters. Access matters, visibility matters, travel routes matter. If you remove all those theories and simply look at the geography, patterns begin to emerge. Now, whether those patterns ultimately support the zone theory is a separate question. The purpose of the theory isn't to force the data into a predetermined shape. The purpose is to identify areas that deserve closer examination. If future evidence disproves part of the theory, then the theory should change. That's how investigations work. The evidence comes first, the theory follows, not the other way around. So as DA continued to examine the reports from Alaska, he found himself becoming less interested in individual events and more interested in recurring locations. And that's where I think some of the most productive research may eventually happen. DA feels the same way. Because if multiple categories of these reports continue appearing along the same corridor, the obvious question becomes, why? That's a question worth asking, regardless of where the answer ultimately leads us.
Well, those travel corridors actually lend a lot of credence to the zone theory.
Yeah, they do. Well, I mean, they're actually part of it if you think about it.
Right, they really are. So why do animals and humans tend to use those routes through difficult terrain?
Well, that's the easy question. Path of least resistance.
Absolutely. That's why game trails exist.
Exactly.
So how do waterways influence the movement patterns?
Water's one of the most important things to life. I mean, if you follow the water, you're going to find everything you need.
That, and for thousands of years, waterways have been our highways
Yeah, I mean, well,
for cars.
if you find the water, you're going to find the prey. You follow the prey, you're going to find the predators. Because the prey follows the water, predators follow the prey, and they both need the water. I mean, that's why you don't camp next to a body of water.
Yep. But the geography basically creates those corridors. I mean, those paths follow ridge lines. They follow natural depressions. They follow places where they're like natural ravines and saddles, because those are the easiest places to navigate. If you're trying to cross over a mountain, you're not going to go over the peak of the mountain when there's a valley or a gap that's much easier to cross.
Yeah. Or even saddles are easier to navigate
Absolutely.
around at times than crossing completely over.
And animals are just like us. They're going to find the easiest path to take it. Why do you think that terrain analysis is so often overlooked by cryptid researchers?
Because I just don't think they think it matters. I think they focus on, like I said earlier, they focus on the certain things that they've always focused on. What color was it? Like you said that you used to do earlier. How big was it? What color was it? How did it move? Things like that. They don't focus on, well, where were you at? What kind of terrain were you in? Were you in a valley? Were you on a peak? Were you near water? Because it just, and I hate to be this way, but I think some people get so focused on the fact that, and by some people I mean some of these researchers, the focus on the fact that it's not an animal, that they think that stuff like that just doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But I think this shows that it actually follows the patterns that
other animals do as well.
Yeah.
Well, let's say, for example, the pattern behavior. Let's say you're chasing a suspect, okay, and you lose sight of the guy. So you ask a guy, "Where did he go?" And he points which way, and he said, "But he dipped over by that dumpster and then ran on down the alley." That is a behavior, and that behavior changes how you're going to investigate that, because he probably dumped a gun, he probably dumped drugs or something he didn't want you to catch him with, and that little tidbit might have just solved the case. But it's the same thing with cryptids. It's those little behaviors, those little details that can change the entire thing. I had one guy swore up and down that Bigfoot was trying to kill him. And I'm like, oh, awesome. Yeah, we'll take this report. I said, okay, well, what did he do? I said, did he attack you? Did he try to get in your house or anything? He said, no. He stuck his head out behind a tree and was staring at me. I'm like, okay, well, what did he do after that? He goes, well, once he realized I saw him, he turned and walked away. I'm like, I don't think he was trying to kill you, buddy. I think you just spotted one, and that once it realized it had been seen, it left. And he goes, oh no, it was going to kill me. So I could not convince the guy that I don't really think he was in any danger, but it was still a solid sighting because the description of the creature that he gave, how high up it was. He even had pictures of tracks, but that changes the whole outcome of the story because he's assuming a behavior when there was none present.
Yeah.
The behavior does not back up that it was quote unquote trying to kill him.
Well, I think a lot of people are guilty of that. They look at a sighting or whatever, and they automatically form, like you said, they automatically form that narrative before they even have anything to back that up. And then, like you said, they go out looking for evidence to prove that
Instead of just simply saying, okay, what do I have right here and what matches up with what I have here?
Right.
But they're so eager to have, this. It's no different than if an officer, and I've told these young guys that I've trained at times, I'm like, don't when you see a car, don't make that the bad guy and then try to find the crime to go along with it just because you see somebody that doesn't look right to you. You find the violation first, then you go from there. I mean, you have to have it's like, and we've talked about it so many times, you can't go from point A to point Z. You have to go all points in between. So you can't arrive a day and say, oh, I want point Z to be where I'm at, so I'm just going to go ahead and go there and miss everything in between, because that could change what the outcome is by the time you get to point Z.
Right. I'm going to go ahead and jump into the next segment because this is a pretty important segment. This is about the missing people. And as we're moving into the final hour here, I wanted to circle back to the disappearances because that's really where this investigation started. Throughout tonight's discussion, we've looked at missing person cases, encounter reports, observation behavior, unusual sounds, visual concealment, and movement corridors. On the surface, those subjects may seem unrelated, but in fact, most people would probably place them into completely separate categories. What interested me was what happens when you stop looking at the individual reports and start looking at the environment where those reports occur. One of the reasons Denali continued appearing in our research wasn't because of any single disappearance. It was because of the same terrain features seem to appear repeatedly regardless of which category report we happen to be studying. And that's important because once you focus on geography, a different picture starts to emerge. The question shifts from what happened to why does it keep happening here? Now, before anybody misunderstands what I'm saying, I'm not suggesting that encounter reports explain disappearances. There's no evidence supporting that conclusion, and we're certainly not going to make that leap tonight. What I'm suggesting is that both data sets appear to occupy the same environment. That's a very different statement. The Nathan Campbell case helped illustrate that point because it forced us to confront the realities of wilderness investigations. Large distances, difficult terrain, limited visibility, natural travel routes, environmental conditions that can complicate even the most determined search effort. Those same factors appear repeatedly in encounter reports. That doesn't establish a connection, it establishes overlap. The distinction matters because too many investigators become focused on the explanation before they fully understand the environment. And one of the questions I found myself asking while researching this episode was whether we've spent too much time focusing on events and not enough time focusing on the locations. If a particular area repeatedly generates disappearances, encounter reports, unusual sounds, and recurring witness observations, shouldn't we be studying the environment just as closely as we're studying the events? I think the answer is yes. The environment is the constant. The reports are variables. That's one of the reasons I continue coming back to Denali and Zone Juliet. Not because I know what's happening there, but because the area keeps producing questions worth asking. And I think it's really kind of a disservice in this that environmental analysis is often overlooked. For example, Mike from Abnormal Investigations, he started recording what phase of the moon encounters were taken in, which I thought was a good point. But environment says just as much about it as anything else. Especially, let's take for example, there's two campgrounds not very far apart. Over on Table Rock Lake, Robbie and I have been to both of them, Joe Bald and Combs Ferry. Those two parks, environmentally, could not be farther apart. They are the terrain was originally similar, but Joe Bald again looks like you could go in there with a grounds crew and start camping there again. Where Combs Ferry looks like a post-apocalyptic scene. What changed? The behaviors changed, but the environment affected that. Combs Ferry is a lot more isolated than Joe Bald. Why? Just because of where it's out on that peninsula. Joe Bald is also on a peninsula, but it's a much broader peninsula. It's a lot more people on it. But Combs Ferry, that area is extremely isolated. And I think that affects why the behaviors are different in that area. It's an environmental tell.
Yeah.
And the environment tells us a lot about the encounters as well. I mean, looking at the environmental areas, you're going to have a lot more overlap when it comes to these type of encounters if all the criteria are met for what it needs. It's got to have food, it's got to have water, it's got to have shelter. All of that's got to be met. So you're far more likely to find a Bigfoot someplace out by, like, say, Combs Ferry or over in Drury-Mincy than you would in downtown Branson, simply because the same things aren't there for it. I'm not saying you wouldn't by chance see one in downtown Branson in the middle of the night. It might walk through a neighborhood. I'm not saying that's not possible. But what I'm saying is certain environments lend themselves much more closely to having these kind of encounters. So, Robbie, you want to tell us about the overlap?
Oh, was that not the one we just did? We did.
No. We just did the missing. And
Okay.
now we're talking about the overlap.
There was just overlap in the. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah,
we
talked briefly about the overlap with the missing.
Sorry. See,
That's
brain's
all right.
not working right. All right. One exercise that's often useful during investigation is removing the conclusion entirely and looking at what's left. Let's take Bigfoot completely out of the conversation for a moment, and let's remove every theory, let's remove every assumption, and let's remove every personal belief. What remains? Well, we still have the disappearance, we still have witness reports, and we still have unusual sounds. We still have recurring observations involving concealment, movement, and terrain. We still have geographic clustering. That's important because it means the pattern exists regardless of what explanation somebody personally prefers. So that's where some of the best discussions occur. Too often people become locked in defending a conclusion, and once that happens, every piece of the information becomes either supporting evidence or opposing evidence. The investigation turns into an argument instead of a search for understanding. We've never found that's particularly useful. I mean, that's all you're doing is one side defending against the other side, then nothing's being accomplished. But the overlap itself is very interesting. Why do certain reports seem to occupy the same regions? Why do similar observations continue appearing across decades? Why do witnesses with no connection to one another often describe comparable experience? Those questions remain interesting regardless of whether somebody believes in Bigfoot or not. In fact, I'd argue that that's a little bit more interesting because now we're investigating the pattern rather than defending a theory. One of the reasons that we think this zone theory generated so much discussion is because it approached the problem from a different direction. Instead of asking whether a creature existed, it asked whether certain locations deserve closer attention. That's a very different question. And in many ways, it's much more it's a much more productive one. The more I looked at Denali, and the more we discussed it, the more we realized the overlap itself may be the most valuable observation. Not because it provides answers, but because it helps identify where future questions should be asked.
Right, and it's significant to note what remains when we remove personal beliefs from the discussion. You know, it's one of those things where you can't approach this over emotionally. Simply because it's a weird case and it involves a disappearance, we can't immediately assume a cryptid is involved. Now, however, I'm not saying a cryptid wasn't involved either, but what we do is have to examine the evidence to eliminate all of the other possibilities. And when we look at the number of cryptid reports, cryptid sightings, and behavior patterns that overlap in a specific area, and then we have disappearances in that area, at that point, the likelihood of cryptid involvement in the disappearance certainly becomes a lot more probable. Does it prove it? No, but its motive, means, and opportunity, which is exactly what we look for in law enforcement.
Yep, 100%.
So that takes us to the biological question. At some point in every discussion like this, eventually arrives at the same place. If these encounter reports represent a real biological organism, which we believe it does, what would that actually mean? And that's a fair question. It's also a question that deserves a serious answer. One of the criticisms often directed at cryptid research is that people spend so much time discussing sightings that they never stop to examine the biological implications. And that's why we talk about things like tongue pops and we talk about adaptive camouflage, because we are discussing it as a real organism, not as, some hodgepodge group of fantasy beliefs that don't apply to real world animals. If an unknown species exists, it has to operate within the same natural world as every other species on the planet. It needs food, it needs water, it needs habitat, it needs a breeding population, it needs a way to survive. And those aren't optional requirements. Those are biological realities. And one of the reasons I've always been interested in behavior is because behavior tends to leave clues. And if an unknown species existed in remote wilderness areas, we would expect certain patterns to emerge. There's that word, patterns, again. We would expect movement corridors. What does the zone theory give us? Movement corridors. What would we would expect access to resources. What does the zone theory give us? It compacts those sightings in those areas with the resources. We would expect behaviors designed to reduce detection, and that is the behaviors that we've observed: tree peaking, moving quickly, disappearing almost in plain sight, leaving a set of trackways that stops in the middle of the field and then backtracks back. In many ways, that's one of the reasons the encounter reports remain so interesting. Not because they prove anything, but because some of the reported behaviors make biological sense. Observation behavior makes sense. Concealment behavior makes perfect sense. Communication behavior makes sense. And movement through predictable terrain features makes absolute sense. Again, none of that proves the existence of an unknown species, but it certainly argues for the logic behind it being there. But what it does suggest is that if such a species exists, which again we believe it does, many of the reported behaviors would be consistent. What have we been talking about? Consistent behaviors. And with that, we'd expect that from a highly intelligent, highly adaptable animal living in a remote wilderness. The challenge is separating behaviors that make biological sense from the conclusions that exceed the available evidence. And that's where responsible investigation becomes important. Robbie, you want to go ahead and jump into the next one?
Yep. Segment 13 is what we can actually say. So one of the things that we've always tried to do when researching these subjects is periodically stop and ask a very simple question. What do we actually know? Not what we suspect, not what we believe, not what we think might be happening, what we can reasonably support with available evidence. We also think DA and I both, based on our backgrounds, think that's really one of the most important things, is because if you don't go where the evidence takes you, then you're going in the wrong direction anyway. You have to let the evidence guide you, not the other way around. So, and after several hours of discussion, it's easy for information assumptions, observation, and theories to start blending together. And that's where the mistakes happen. If we look back over everything we've discussed tonight, there are a few things that we can say with reasonable degree of confidence. We can say that Alaska continues to generate a significant number of wilderness disappearances, obviously. We can say that Denali and the surrounding Alaskan range have produced encounter reports for decades. And we can say that certain behavioral observations appear repeatedly in witness testimony. We can also say that some locations seem to generate multiple categories of reports more frequently than others. We can say that terrain plays a major role in both encounter and disappearance. None of these statements are particularly controversial. I think we've pretty much shown that those are almost like, the complete opposite of controversial.
Because they're gaining a lot of traction in this community.
Yep. So where things become more difficult is when we start moving beyond those observations. Can we say that every encounter report is genuine? No. But can we say that every witness correctly interpreted what they observed? No, again, no, we can't. Get down. Sorry, I was getting attacked.
Your cat's demanding attention.
Yeah, she knows it's past time. So what was that? Can we say that every witness has correctly interpreted what they've observed? Again, no. There's no way to do that. Can we say the encounter reports explain disappearances? Absolutely not. Can we say that adaptive camouflage has been proven? No. That the tongue pop theory has been proven? No. But you know what? That's okay. Because one of the biggest mistakes people make in this field is assuming that uncertainty represents failure. It doesn't. Sometimes uncertainty is simply the most honest answer available. Like DA said earlier, I don't know. It's okay to say that. In fact, that's what we've argued, that acknowledging uncertainty is one of the most important responsibilities as an investigator. The moment we become more interested in defending a conclusion than understanding the evidence, we kind of stop being investigators at that point and kind of crossed into being something else. And that's why we keep coming back to the same idea. The purpose of tonight's discussion wasn't to solve Denali. The purpose was to identify patterns that deserve further study. Some of those patterns may eventually lead somewhere significant. Some may turn out to have entirely conventional explanations, which happens all the time. Either outcome is valuable because both outcomes increase our understanding. And at the end of the day, good research isn't about proving yourself right. It's about following the evidence, whether it leads or wherever it leads, and being willing to adjust your conclusions when new information becomes available. That's how investigations move forward.
Absolutely. So, as we wrap things up tonight, I want to go back to the question that started this entire investigation. Why does Denali keep showing up? And that's really what brought us here. Not any one particular sighting, not a particular disappearance, not even a particular theory, a pattern. The more I researched Alaska, and the more often Denali and the surrounding region seemed to appear, regardless of what category of report that I was studying. Sometimes it was a missing person case. Sometimes it was an encounter report. Sometimes it was a historical account that had largely been forgotten. Eventually, I reached a point where I felt the area deserved a much closer look. And after spending the evening examining disappearances, encounter reports, observation behavior, unusual sounds, concealment behavior, and movement corridors, I think we've learned something important. Not about what's happening, but about where we should be looking. One of the reasons we first created the zone theory Why we think it's so useful is because it encourages us to pay attention to locations rather than becoming overly focused on individual stories. Stories do matter. Witnesses matter. The evidence matters. But sometimes the most valuable clues emerge when we step back and examine the larger picture. And the larger picture tonight suggests that Denali occupies a unique position within Zone Juliet. Whether that ultimately reflects geography, environmental conditions, human behavior, wildlife behavior, some combination of those factors, or something we haven't even identified yet, remains an open question. And honestly, I think that's where the most interesting investigations begin. Not with answers, but with questions. And if there's one thing I hope listeners take away from tonight's episode, it's that a good investigation rarely moves in a straight line. Sometimes progress comes from identifying a pattern, sometimes it comes from challenging a theory, and sometimes it comes from realizing that we've been asking the wrong question the whole time. As researchers, our responsibility isn't to force the evidence to a conclusion. Our responsibility is to follow the evidence and see where it leads us. That's what we've tried to do tonight. Now, whether we're discussing disappearances, encounter reports, adaptive camouflage, tongue pop theory, or zone theory itself, the goal remains the same. Ask questions, examine evidence, and remain open to new information. And never become so attached to an explanation that you stop investigating. Because the moment that happens, the discovery ends. So, Robbie, what do you think was the most compelling part of tonight's investigation?
The most compelling. Honestly, I mean, I think it has to be all of it because, I mean, if you start taking one thing over the other, I think that kind of leads you down that slippery slope of losing sight of the bigger picture. And that's just my opinion in it. I don't think there's one factor that outweighs the other. I don't, I think, like you said, behavior, terrain, location. I think all that stuff is just as important in and of itself and combined. I don't think you can take one away from the other because, like we said, if you have an encounter that only has, one of the terrain features, and that kind of weakens the overall strength of the sighting. We've talked about that. Well, it had, it was here, but it didn't have this, so it's not as good a sighting as this other one. So I just think that when you put all those together, it makes it a more solid case. And I know you can't have sightings with every single one of those in it, but the more of them that you have, I think makes it a better overall sighting.
Yeah, I agree. And going forward from here, at least for us, how much do you think zone theory is going to affect how we approach investigations?
Oh, I mean, I think it already had. I think, that's something because ever since we've had that show, you, Doc, and I know Steve hadn't been on since we've had that show, but you, Doc, and I, it seems like every time that we bring up a new sighting, one or all of us will say, "Hey, is that what zone is that in? Is that in this, or is that in the overlap zone? Is that I've noticed that we do that a lot now." So,
and it makes perfect sense. I mean, we're using terrain to not only classify these behaviors, but to actually help us predict them.
Yep.
So, folks, how about you guys in the chat? What stood out for you guys, and what do you guys think of the conclusions we've reached? I would really like you guys' input on this. I'd like to see if you guys think we're just full of hot air, if you agree with some of the conclusions, if you agree with any of the conclusions, or you agree with all of the conclusions. I'd like to hear what you guys think and see how you feel about this evidence-based approach to not only behavior, and to the sightings and the disappearances, but factoring in the zone theory to help not only explain but predict future encounters. See if anybody responds to that before we move on. Just guy says tongue pop theory's got to be more credible than just a theory. Didn't you have a Class B encounter when you? Yes, I did. Well, the reason I even learned to tongue pop is growing up on the farm out north of Lebanon. I used to mimic animal sounds. I would do like bird chirps, and I'd mimic the dogs, and I'd mimic the cows. I just any animal I heard, I tried to repeat the sound, and I got pretty good at it. But in the evenings, I would always hear this popping sound coming from the back of our property. There was a big stand of trees at the back of our field, and I would hear this popping sound like almost every evening. And I tried like whacking two sticks together, and that wasn't it. I tried hitting a tree with a baseball bat, and that wasn't it. I just tried lots of things. I even tried like that, like the pop thing, and that wasn't it. And then I started trying to pop my tongue, like by pulling it off the roof of my mouth. And it's kind of difficult to explain how it works, but you basically put your tongue against the roof of your mouth, just behind your teeth, and kind of pull it backwards using an inhale as for pressure. And you can make different sounds with it. I can echo it across a lake. I can it be heard way down a valley. There's different tones you can make, and that one sounds a lot like wood on wood. And to me, the tongue pop theory, I think, is just it makes the most sense, and that's how we got the footprints outside our cabin in Gatlinburg was me popping my tongue. Thank you, Don. Challenge says the terrain in the area mixed with the evidence differently affects. Yeah, absolutely. Lone Queen says the field of study is multifaceted or layered, and each contributes. I totally agree.
Yep.
That's why we're always looking for we don't lock ourselves into any one conclusion. And if at some point that we find something that suggests tongue popping is not a factor, then we will move on to other theories. But if our theory of Bigfoot being largely subterranean is true, the tongue popping theory applies right into teaching itself to echolocate, which we've talked about on numerous shows. CD Lampley says, DA and Robbie, since y'all started talking about the cave system theory, I noticed more and more people are talking about it. We've talked about a lot of things before any of the bigger channels have picked it up. The Tony Roosevelt connection, zone theory starting to show up. I've heard a few people talking about the zones.
Adaptive camouflage.
Adaptive camouflage. That's another one. We've got a lot of things that are really gaining ground, in my opinion, and I think not only are we on the right track, but we're on the right track enough so that other investigators are starting to take notice, and I'm really thrilled by that. Just a guy says, are the clear hair shafts going to be something you guys will look in future investigations on hotspots? Is the theory that only Sasquatch have them, or Dogmen and all the other critters too? Well, the only ones we know for sure so far are suspected Sasquatch hairs, but we're not going to rule it out on any of the others. And that is something we are looking for as we find hair samples. That's one of the first things we check for is for clear hair shafts, and then generally to have them tested. But yeah, absolutely. I think the clear hair shaft may explain a lot of things. But again, they show us clear hair shafts. Not necessarily every hair on the creature is clear, but enough of them to help it blend. It appears in a lot of different animals, and it's if it's a factor in some animals, why couldn't it appear in a cryptid? And to me, that just makes the most sense. But folks, I think that's going to do it for us tonight. I know Robbie needs to get to bed. He's been up early and hadn't had a whole lot of sleep. But as always, we appreciate each and every one of you guys spending part of your evening with us. Whether you're joining us live, listening to us on iHeartRadio, or catching the podcast version, or watching a replay even later in the week, we're grateful that you're here. And if you've enjoyed tonight's content, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and if you haven't already, share the show with somebody who enjoys cryptids and monsters and folklore and missing persons investigations and anything unexplained. Those simple actions help more than most people realize and allow us to help to continue growing the Nightmare Hunters community. We'd also like to thank our channel members, Patreon supporters, and anyone who helps support the show. Your support allows us to continue researching these topics, traveling when the opportunities arise, and bringing these investigations to you every week. Tonight, we looked at Denali through a slightly different lens. Instead of focusing on a single sighting or a single disappearance, we tried to step back and examine the bigger picture. So whether you agree with our conclusions or disagree with them entirely, I hope the discussion at least gave you something to think about, because that's always been the goal. We're not here to tell you what to believe. We're here to ask questions, follow the evidence, and explore ideas that deserve a closer look. So before we go, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What stood out to you tonight? Which observations do you think deserve additional investigation? Are the patterns we discussed meaningful, or are we looking at coincidences that only appear to be connected from a distance? Let us know in the comments, and you can leave comments on the show afterwards, and I'll be reading all of those. So until next time, y'all stay safe, keep asking the right questions, and never stop looking beyond the surface. And we'll see you on the next episode of the Nightmare Hunters podcast. And don't forget to check out our affiliates, the good folks at Dark Angel Medical. Use discount code Cryptid20 for 20% off your order. Check out everybody over at darkangelmedical.com. Check out everybody at Scallywag Tactical, best blades in the business. Scallywagtactical.com. Use discount code DARoberts10 for 10% off your order. And the good folks at Sigwo Arms, sigwoarms.com. All your pew-pew needs for all you shooting enthusiasts, they've got it all. Check them out and use discount code Bigfoot5 for 5% off your entire order. And that becomes 10 if you're a first responder or a veteran. Just let them know during checkout. So check those folks out. They've got everything from ammo to whisper pickles and anything in between. So again, check all those guys out and let them know we sent you. And we wouldn't be anywhere in this channel without the authors we've got going. Doc's an author, Jed's an author, I'm an author. Check out all of our books on Amazon.com. You can find them all in Kindle, print, and in electronic form. Kindle, print, and audio formats. They're all available. They're all entertaining reads, and I hope you guys are engaged and become part of the bigger universe of these stories. So check them all out. You can, again, check them all out on Amazon.com, or you can find mine on DARoberts.net. So having said all that, we are going to close her out tonight with a toast. And I think I will close it out with the toast tonight. And let me put it up on the screen. It's an old Irish drinking song, and I want to share it with you guys. The quote says, "But since it fell into my lot that I should rise and you should not, I'll gently rise and softly call. Good night and joy be to you all." Good night, everyone. Thank you for being here. Slàinte, and we will see you next Wednesday. Good night.
Slàinte.
Plains, the winds are howling, saloon doors swinging, shadows growling. Three lawmen stand tough as rawhide. Yeah, Doc DA, nothing can abide. Whiskey shots and poker faces, staring down the darkest spaces in this town where legends roam. These boys bring justice, sending evil home. Cryptid lawmen, wild and free, hunting monsters for all to see. With silver bullets and grit of steel, they fight the darkness, make the demons squeal. From dusty canyons to moonlit plains, justice rides with wind and rains. Cryptid lawmen, a fearsome sight, standing tall against the endless night. skill. Doc's a biter, makes the devil real, but DA's a shifty one. A shape-shifting soul can turn to anything, takes any form, takes control. Tonight the chupacabras come to town, sucking the life from all around. But these lawmen, they ain't afraid. They'll face the darkness unafraid. Cryptid lawmen, wild and free, hunting monsters for all to see. With silver bullets and grit of steel, they fight the darkness, make the demons squeal. From dusty canyons to moonlit plains, justice rides with wind and rain. Cryptid lawmen, a fearsome sight, standing tall against the endless night. Full moon rises, bat wings flap, the air grows cold, a chill and trap. But these lawmen, they're ready to fight underneath the pale moonlight. Jed and Doc transform with a howl. DA shifts, becomes a night owl.